Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is a webinar from the IIRSM East Midlands branch. I'm Daniel Staines. I'm currently the chair of that branch, and we are joined today by Rosie Russell, who's going to give us a talk on neurodiversity, which is quite a hot topic at the minute. So over to you, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Dan. So, as Dan said, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about neurodiversity. It's a hot topic for an awful lot of people, but it's been around, I think, longer than many of us will probably realize. And certainly one of the things that I've heard is people saying about the rise of neurodiversity. Where has all of this come from? Now, if you're not familiar, the infinity rainbow symbol, that is the symbol that people use to denote neurodiversity. So if you're seeing that in a pin badge or something, the individual is actually letting you know that they are neurodiverse. But where did it all come from? I've heard that so many times. And they're basically saying, oh, well, there didn't used to be many people who are neurodiverse, and now they're everywhere. You know, how has this suddenly happened? What's gone on? So I've got this graph on the screen here, and I've blocked out a little bit of it. And you know, it's meant to imply that there's been a sudden rise in neurodiversity. But if we actually take a look at the time scale on this graph, we find that we're going back into the 1880s. And if I unblock the scale, and then what we're actually looking here is the history of left-handedness in the United States. What we actually find is that when we are more aware that something is part of the diversity of the human condition, and we stop trying to suppress that or punish that, people are able to be themselves. And here we see that in the early 1900s, it became more acceptable to be left-handed in the United States. Now, that's not that there were more left-handed people than there were in at the beginning of the century. It's merely that people were using their dominant hand by preference. That's all. So in terms of neurodiversity, the difference really is awareness. We didn't understand that a lot of these conditions existed, whereas we do now. So it's much more acceptable for people to talk about neurodiversity. The medical profession understands more about neurodiversity. And as we're going to find out, there are, in some cases, some advantages to being neurodiverse. So what are we looking at here? It's an absolute minefield. This diagram comes from Forbes magazine. And we can see that there is quite a number of conditions. And I do use the word condition here because if we take a look on the left, we have ASC, Autistic Spectrum Condition. Used to be referred to as Autistic Spectrum Disorder. And what we are now understanding is that it's not a disorder. It is a condition. It is part of the natural wiring of the human brain, the natural diversity of how we come about. And that whilst some of these conditions come with disadvantages in some areas, they come with great advantages in other areas. And it's actually for us to shift our thinking to understand people who are neurodiverse and help them to make best use of the strengths of their conditions. So, how common are neurodiverse conditions? Well, let's start with the most common, dyslexia. That is about 10% of the population. Now, there is a range in the severity of the condition, from severely dyslexic to slightly dyslexic. And that is the same with all of these conditions. In fact, I myself am on the slightly dyslexic end, something that was picked up when I was at school. But in my case, it's not a big barrier to normal day-to-day living, and I'm an avid reader. Dyspraxia. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this one, this is a condition that affects coordination. I'm sure you're well familiar with people who are, shall we say, a little on the clumsy side. Doesn't mean they're dyspraxic, but it could well be that that is the case. And that's about 6% of the population. Dyscalculia, or problems with numbers. In fact, the dys bit means a problem with. So dyslexia is a difficulty with language. Dyspraxia is a difficulty with movement. Dyscalculia is a difficulty with numbers. And we'll have all come across people say, oh, I can't do maths. Again, that doesn't mean they have dyscalculia. But people with this condition do find simple mathematics and numerical concepts difficult. Then we move into ADHD or ADD. So this is attention and deficit hyperactivity disorder, although we should be calling it a condition now. And you also have attention deficit disorder. So this can come with or without the hyperactivity. And then we have autistic spectrum conditions. This is about 1 in 50 of the population, about 2%. And then there are tic conditions. So Tourette's would be the most famous of those. But I'm sure you know some people who have certain types of movements, things that they do habitually. These are all tic conditions, and they affect up to about 3% of the population. And these can be physical or verbal tics. But overall, somewhere between about 15 and 20% of the population is affected by one or more of these conditions. And I say or more because if we add up those numbers on the screen, it comes to substantially higher than 20%. So what we find is that co-occurrence is the rule. In fact, autism, ADHD, or autism dyslexia, these are incredibly common co-occurrences. But the upshot of this is there's an almost infinite range of presentation of neurodiverse conditions. We've got the range of severity of the condition, and then we've got the possibility for 1, 2, 3, 4 co-occurrences to happen. So we have an infinite range of presentation of neurodiversity. This means if you've met one neurodiverse person, you have met one neurodiverse person. Whilst there are certain generalisms that will hold around each of the individual conditions, when we start blending them, some of those generalisms fall away. A prime example would be the autism and dyslexia combination. One of the things that dyslexia gives you, and we'll see this in a minute, is actually excellent verbal communication skills, which is something somebody with autism lacks. So you can actually get some compensation there. So you can have someone with autism with good communication skills. The next thing I want to look at is intelligence. This is a very misunderstood construct. This is based on the work of Howard Gardner. And commonly, when we think about intelligence, we think about people's language processing, their ability to undertake logic-related tasks, to be spatially aware. And if you take these three together, we actually find the basis for the IQ test. Now, the IQ test is a number. We know it's imperfect. And the average intelligence is an IQ of 100. That, for some reason, seems to be a shock to some people, but that is the center of the bell curve. 50% of the population above, 50% below. The original intent of this test was to check where students' learning was at and to help them improve from there. It's only later it became a standardized test of intelligence. And in fact, the original premise holds that actually you can increase your measured IQ by doing lots of IQ tests. It's something that is learnt. But it misses out so many other facets of intelligence. So, for instance, movement, kinesthetic intelligence, musical intelligence, interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence, and naturalist intelligence. And if we think about who might be high on some of these different facets of intelligence, well, in linguistics, we think about writers, storytellers, editors, journalists, translators. For logic, well, that's mathematicians, it'd be high-end scientists, accountants, statisticians, programmers. And when we move on to spatial, well, we can see things like architects, artists, a cartographer, a surveyor, an inventor even. So we can see that those three make up our traditional view of intelligence, but we then miss out movement. So athletes, dancers, sculptors, mechanics. You know, I'm sure some mechanics have a very good understanding of how things fit together and how they can actually then work on these machines. Musical intelligence. Well, this is our musicians, composers, piano tuner. Interpersonal. Well, counsellors, politicians, managers, good managers maybe. Intrapersonal, entrepreneurs, psychotherapists, clergy fall into being high on this scale. And naturalists, this is about biology, zoology. You'll also find medics and vets being quite high here. They understand naturally how a body or a biological ecosystem works. So rather than IQ being a single number, it's lumpy and messy and is made up of lots of different bits and pieces. So this hypothetical map of intelligence that I've put on, we've got someone who's very high on intrapersonal skills and spatial skills and musical skills. So when we start talking about conditions, neurodiverse conditions, this question comes up a lot, enabled or disabled? And the basic problem here is that we are wired to think about conditions along the medical model. If I use the example of a broken leg, that person can't walk. Well, maybe they can with crutches. So there's a can't attached to this person. The reality is, however, they can still get on with their day-to-day life while their leg is healing if there are no barriers in the way of them doing that. Now, job is physical. It's going to be somewhat difficult. But even just going to the shops, going out to a restaurant, that mobility impairment now restricts them. And under the medical model, we say that's as a result of their broken leg. But under the social model, we say no. It's as a result of how we have designed society. They are struggling to get round because there are stairs to get into the restaurant. There isn't an accessible toilet. They've got to go down some stairs for that. You know, perhaps they're struggling to open a door, but it's very easy to change that. If we think about how society is designed these days, there are an awful lot of ramps, automatic doors, lifts, and these have enabled people with physical disabilities to have the barriers to their performance removed. Now, the same comes with neurodiversity. If we take some of the common problems that someone with autism has, for instance, sensitivity to noise, light, interruptions. In the workplace, that's actually relatively easy to fix. You know, find them a quiet location, educate the workforce that interruptions aren't good. Turn down the lighting in the area and give them task lighting so they have control. So we need to shift our thinking fundamentally from diagnosis to barriers. And the advantage of shifting our thinking this way is we no longer require people to have a label before we start trying to accommodate them. So if we take a look now at, I've got 6 of the most common neurodiverse conditions, and we now shift our thinking as well, we find that there are strengths and abilities with a lot of these conditions. If we take autism as our first example, really fine attention to detail, but they have excellent pattern recognition. If we go back before the Industrial Revolution and go back even further to when perhaps we were hunter-gatherers, pattern recognition would have been very, very useful. Being able to understand that hiding in that bush was a leopard, or that that snake was a problem and that one over there wasn't. And the kind of attention to detail that that person could bring, you could see that could be very, very useful in a hunter-gatherer or even a farming type of environment. They're also very rule-bound, you know, so as well as the attention to detail, they're good at repetitive tasks and doing it the same way and understanding this is how it's meant to be done. You can see for an awful lot of modern processes, this could be a real advantage. Certainly, some organizations are now hiring for autism for certain tasks. There's a company in Europe that does software testing, and most of their staff are on the autistic spectrum. And if you want to employ them, you will pay above what you would pay for other testers. Why? Because they are really good at it. But they may have some challenges: social skills, interpreting non-verbal communication, managing change. But if we remove those barriers, so lessen the expectation of social interaction, if we communicate more perhaps by email, written communication, if we are sensitive around change in the workplace, then there is no reason why somebody with autism cannot work. And there is a famous lady who has since passed away, who she said she was described as low functioning or non-verbal autistic, and she couldn't communicate. Except she can communicate It's just we don't understand her language. She is faulted because we don't understand how she communicates. Stick her in front of a computer, on the other hand, and all is well. So we have up on the screen dyscalculia. Excellent problem solvers, lateral thinking, they're creative, they're good communicators, but they will have some challenges around mathematical formula, time management. When we go on to dyslexia, strength, communication again. Entrepreneurial acumen. It's quite well known that you will find dyslexics overrepresented in chief executive officers. Richard Branson is actually a famous example of this. Now, he's been able to overcome his barriers by having people who can do the things for him that he's not so good at. But again, dyslexia or employing someone with dyslexia can bring skills to your team that are very valuable, but they may need more time, read documents, write reports. They might need access to assistive technology. Moving on to ADHD, lateral and creative thinking. They're really good at interpreting things in numbers and shapes. So you want to put some life into a report, your ADHD person is the one that you need. But they're easily distracted. They take a while to onboard new information, and they've got very little sense of time. But I wish to dispel one of the common misconceptions about people with ADHD. People say they can't concentrate. The opposite is actually true. ADHD comes with the ability to hyper-focus, and that can be focusing on a task for a very long period of time, getting very deep into something. The key here is that they have to be interested in it. They have to be motivated to want to do it. But one of the things here is interruptions for somebody with ADHD are a really bad thing. Someone who is in that hyper-focus, if you break it, it can take a long while for them to get that back. So the working environment for someone with ADHD is very important. Being able to block out distractions. We have dyspraxia. We talked about a difficulty with movement. But again, they are creative, lateral thinkers. And people with Tourette's, they're very innovative. Again, very creative. And all of these conditions come with challenges, yes. But they are challenges, why? They are challenges because society has said what's normal. So we have the concept of someone being neuronormative. But normal is an interesting word. It only appeared in the Oxford English Dictionary in the 1840s. So it's really concurrent with the Industrial Revolution, standardization, measuring things, trying to decide what a normal range is. Before that, the concept didn't really exist. People were just people, and they found their niche in society. So I think we need to stop talking about neurodiversity. We need to stop talking about neuronormative and start talking about neuroinclusion. This is why. Because of the barriers that society puts in place, because of the obstacles that people with a neurodiverse condition have to overcome, they're expending much more energy. And 70% of neurodiverse individuals suffer from poor mental health. because they are trying so hard to conform to the normal. World of physical conditions. Christine Miserandino wrote an essay called Spoon Theory, and I commend it to you. It's well worth having a look at. She suffers with lupus, and she was trying to explain to a friend of hers why life is more difficult for her. And she was trying to explain that she has to use so much of her day-to-day energy budget just to live with the condition that she has to choose carefully what else she does. Her friend was not getting this, and they were in a restaurant, and she just grabbed a load of spoons from the cutlery drawer that was nearby and said, "Here you go," and held up a fist of spoons, saying, "This is my energy budget for the day. I get up, that's a spoon. I have a shower, that's a spoon. I have breakfast, that's a spoon. I travel to work, well, I live in London Underground, that's probably 2 or 3 spoons. And then work, so many spoons. Getting home, so many spoons. And you can see the hand getting more and more empty. And her friend kind of realized and went, "Oh, I'm so sorry that I'm, making you expend some of your effort on me." And she said, no, I choose to spend some time with you and spend a spoon. So I quite often use the phrase "running low on spoons" when my energy levels are low. Now, I don't suffer with lupus, but we can very easily extend this thought experiment to someone who is living with autism and is having to mask most of that autism to conform to a neuronormative environment. They're probably low on spoons by the end of just about every day. So if they seem a little bit terse, a little bit cranky, a little bit direct sometimes, it's quite simply their energy level is low. But we can remove a lot of the barriers, so they're not expending spoons on interacting with the neuronormative. So in his book, Power of Neurodiversity, Thomas Armstrong, he set out a number of principles of neurodiversity. I commend the book to you. It's probably the best that I've read on the subject. The first point he makes is that the brain works more like an ecosystem than a machine. The concept of the brain and the body as a machine is something that has come out of modern science and industrial thinking. But our bodies aren't machines, they're ecosystems. And if you disturb an ecosystem, it has to find a new equilibrium. Human beings and human brains exist along continuums of experience. You saw that with the slide on intelligence. This is the first bit where barriers start to come in. Human competence is defined by the culture to which you belong. If you think about an athlete, for instance. An athlete does not need to be particularly intelligent. They just need to be very athletic. But wait a minute. Movement was one form of intelligence. So they need to be very intelligent along that axis. And they are then defined as being very competent. They're very competent about what they do because we value that type of intelligence in that type of person. And this is the start of the concept of niche construction. People who are neurodiverse, finding a niche in which their particular set of skills are valued is the path to harmonious existence for a neurodiverse person. So whether you are disabled or gifted depends largely on when and where you were born. I alluded to really good pattern recognition being advantageous perhaps in a hunter-gatherer type of environment. ADHD, on the other hand, definitely of value in a farming type environment. Boundless energy, the ability to move between different tasks quite quickly. So again, what you have and whether you are defined as being disabled very much depends on your context, your niche. For a neurodiverse person, success in life is based on adapting your brain to the needs of the surrounding environment. Now, I said earlier that neurodiverse people suffer from worse mental health than neuronormative people. And that's because they're trying to adapt their interaction with the society around them to the needs of other people. But if we change and are accepting of neurodiverse traits and we remove some of the barriers, they have then a higher mental budget. They have more spoons available. And actually, it turns out that the brain is remarkably adaptable. And if we can create an environment where a neurodiverse person isn't spending most of their spoons on interacting with us in a way that's convenient for us, they actually then have more of an energy budget to expend on adapting slightly to the environment. So they get to settle in, they get to acclimatize. And what we find is that someone with autistic traits, provided they are in an accepting environment, will acclimatize to that environment, and they'll actually get better at some of the things that we would say are more neuronormative traits. So it's this modifying the surrounding environment to fit your needs, which is niche construction, but then that allows there to be an energy budget for us to then adapt to the things that we can't change. So niche construction includes a lot of things, career and lifestyle choices. So take myself, for instance. I am most definitely an introvert. I am not a gregarious person who enjoys a noisy environment and meeting lots of people. Yet my job is office-based. I have a level of seniority where I have my own office. I have a niche. Now, we can also help create that niche with things like assistive technologies. So voice recognition software, screen reading software. There are an awful lot of very good packages out there that make interacting with computers easier. But one of the barriers we put in people's way is we say, that's fine, the company will buy you a copy of some dictation software and a nice headset with noise cancelling headphones once you give us your diagnosis. And that's gatekeeping. That is putting a barrier in the way that's not necessary. Quite simply because we want the best out of our staff. Why wouldn't we make some of these adaptions available to, well, everybody? Because it's fundamentally about control and freedom to make your own decisions. I certainly know 20 odd years ago, somebody wanted to wear headphones in the workplace. You say, oh, you can't do that. You might not be aware of your surroundings. You might not hear the fire alarm going. But it's actually relatively easy to swap out a detector to one that has a flashing beacon. You've just removed that barrier. We also need progressive HR policies, and we need to tailor our management to the needs of the individual. And that way we will get the best out of people. And as I alluded to already, when we get somebody in a good, comfortable niche, they can then modify their own brain, which enhances their ability to adapt to the environment. It's this ecosystem concept of finding a new equilibrium that actually works. So where do we commonly find neurodiverse people? ADHD. 37% of marketing professionals. We find dyslexia in construction, logistics, architecture, engineering, healthcare. No surprise probably that we find it in the arts. Autism, very much overrepresented in technology and biotechnology. So the barriers to being productive as a neurodiverse individual, well, they come from the workplace, and they come from the work culture, and they come from the work design. But who's in charge of that? And the answer is management every single time, because we can then eliminate those barriers through the same workplace, work culture, and work design. So what does a neuro-inclusive workplace look like? Well, if we start with management and HR, we need to be supportive and aware of neurodiversity. We need to be open, supportive, and person-centered. Our policies need to allow people to thrive. They need to remove barriers and demedicalize conditions. Because you can be autistic without a diagnosis. You can just work better in a quiet environment and headphones without having to have a diagnosis of ADHD or autism or any of the other conditions. We then need to focus on mental well-being. And it starts with workload management, and this is a whole nother talk on stress and where stress comes from. But overloading people is not going to result in good mental health. But it's also then about making sure that the right support is there for every individual, and that there is almost a menu of options for support, so that people have the freedom to tailor what it is they need. At the very least, you should have an employee assistance program, but mental health champions, coaching, mentoring, diversity networks. All of these are relatively easy to implement, but can make the world of difference for somebody who is wired differently. And I do say wired differently. If you think that people with ADHD take Ritalin to calm their minds down, Ritalin is a stimulant. If you or I took that, we'd be climbing the walls. So their brains are wired differently. We then need to tackle the workplace culture. So we do equity, diversity, and inclusion training, but it needs to target neurodiversity. It needs to make the point that it's somewhere between one in 6 and 1 in 5 of our workforce. So we need to be able to create an environment where for certain people, there is a low level of interruptions. There is a tolerance of differences in routines. I mean, bear in mind, for instance, people with autism, some of them have very fixed routines. And it's worth noting that that's not a habit that needs breaking. That's a coping mechanism. Then when it comes to designing the workplace, now, most of us don't have the ability to go and build a new building, make it friendly to the neurodiverse. But there is a standard out there, PAS 6463, and it's designing for the mind. In there, and it's a very practical guidance standard, publicly accessible, free to download from the British Standards Institute. And it will give you an awful lot of practical ideas of things that you can do in your workplace design that allow people who are neurodiverse to find their niche. Problem is, we talked about normal earlier. I could also introduce the term average. And we have a tendency to design for the average. The problem is that's one size fits nobody. As an example, you could think about workplace temperature and the perennial fight over the thermostat. But it's perfectly possible to create an open plan workspace where it's warmer on one side than the other, and then allow people to move to where they find themselves to be comfortable. We already encounter difference in some workplaces with, for instance, core working hours. My own workplace is 10 till 4. Now, I tend to be in fairly early in the morning because I'm a morning lark. Yet, people who are night owls will tend to come in later. And that's about that choice and freedom. Making available productivity tools to your workforce will happily spend £600 to £1,000 on a sit-stand desk for somebody with a bad back. Same again for an expensive ergonomic chair if that's what's required and recommended to us by occupational health or the ergonomist. Yet we think twice about spending a few £100 on dictation software, screen reader, screen tinting software, productivity tools, headphones. It just doesn't make sense to me often that we're very good around physical disability, but neurodiverse conditions seem to mystify us. And then when it comes to our role, again, we seem to have this one size fits none approach to work. If you're in a team of people, some people in that team will be better at some parts of the work than others. Let them specialize. In actual fact, the evidence shows us that where you let teams diversify and specialize, and where you value diversity, you can be looking at up to 30% higher productivity because you have different ways of thinking. You have different ways of approaching problems. But where certain things have to be done, job descriptions need to be clear and instructions need to be clear. A good example of where I've fallen foul of that myself is in a previous job when I was a lab manager and health and safety officer fairly early in my career. I told one of the lab technicians, no matter what you do before you go home, that stockroom needs to be spotless. You can see immediately my mistake. I gave what could be taken as an overriding command. What I meant was, we have a visit from some of our corporate team tomorrow, and they are going to be going on a tour. I want to make sure that the stockroom is presentable. But please continue with your day-to-day work, and when you have a bit of time, come and tidy it up. I wasn't clear. And what happened was, I walked past the stockroom on my way to lunch, and there was that individual issuing stock to people, standing there and not letting anybody in, and they were getting the stock and tidying things up and handing it to them. And nobody was complaining because, you know, he knew where everything was. But my own lack of understanding of his neurodiversity meant my communication was lacking, not his performance. So that's a very brief tour through the world of neurodiversity. If you want to learn more, you could do no worse than starting with The Power of Neurodiversity by Thomas Armstrong. But basically, thinking about the fact that it's 1 in 6 to 1 in 5 of our colleagues are neurodiverse, accepting of difference, of diversity, and dispensing with the word normal can get us a long way to helping our neurodiverse colleagues get the best out of the environment that they're in, and actually then contribute far more. Thank you very much.
Hi, Rosie. That was great. Thanks a lot. It's given me a lot to think about. If there's any questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat. I mean, I've got a couple of questions actually, and I think some of the last points that you said sort of ring true. It's like when you are sending a message, sometimes the receiver doesn't always receive the message in the intent you've sent it. How do you think it's best to communicate to get their understanding of what you've said to them in the first place?
Checking understanding is key. If you think about pilots, when they change control of the aircraft between them, they use closed loop communication. Yeah, you have control, I have control, you have control. Okay, that's a very simple example, but using that closed loop communication approach, had I have spoken to this technician and said, do you understand what I'm saying? Can you say that back to me? Bear in mind, I knew they were neurodiverse. He'd have probably said, I'm going to stand there all day there and make sure that that's absolutely fine. And I'd go, that's not what I meant. So sometimes, whilst we're in a hurry, we'll issue a command. We need to think about the fact that once the words have left our mouth, how that is heard by another person isn't in our control. Unless we check what was heard, we will get it wrong.
And also, you said there that you knew you had a little bit of neurodiversity. What about if you don't know? What's the best way to open up a conversation to try and get that understanding?
I think there what I'm going to say is you're immediately falling into the trap of medicalizing a condition. Quite often when you're looking to open up a conversation, really what you're looking to know is, are you dyslexic? You know, is that why you're making all these mistakes? It's better to open up a conversation around how can I best help you? How can I create an environment where you do your best? And it could be, I have noticed that your grammatical construction, your use of words is not to the same standard that perhaps I would expect. And that could be as simple as helping them turn on the spell checker, download Grammarly. But it could be a case of them going, to be honest, whilst I grasp the concepts, I'm really bad with written communication. You don't need a diagnosis of dyslexia there. What you need is an environment where someone can have an honest conversation with you. And that starts with trust. If you don't have that trust between a manager and their line report, to get hold of this and go back to school and start with Management 101.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I think sometimes I try and reflect on how we talk and the words we use, maybe the environments that we work in, and sometimes that does need to change. And I think what you talked about really gives a bit of food for thought. So thank you for that. I've just done a quick look on the chat. There's no more questions on the Q&A, so I think if that's okay, we'll bring it to a close. So thank you very much, everyone joining us, and thank you very much to Rosie. It's been great having you. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon.
Very much.
Thank you all. Take care.